No, it's not possible. Not true.
There is a particular kind of betrayal that does not announce itself with a slammed door or a raised voice. It arrives instead inside an envelope, on letterhead, with a date stamped at the top and a signature at the bottom. And it tells you in the calm, bureaucratic language of estate law that the 20 years you spent believing your family understood what you had given them was a story you were telling yourself. Vivian Carter sat in a conference room in Atlanta, Georgia on a Tuesday afternoon in March and listened to an attorney read her father's will out loud. And somewhere around the third paragraph, she understood that the man who had built a development company from nothing, the man who had once told her with his hand over his heart that he would never forget what she gave up for this family, had signed a document 2 years before his death that left her with almost nothing, and standing across the room from her, accepting condolences from people who had known their family for 30 years, was her younger brother Terrence. The same brother whose tuition she had paid for out of her own paycheck for 4 straight years when she was in her 20s. The same brother who had just inherited nearly everything their father spent a lifetime building. This is the story of what Vivian found when she finally asked the one question nobody in her family wanted her to ask, which was simply this: why did her father's last wishes contradict everything he had told her his entire life? And the answer to that question was sitting sealed in an envelope inside a law office across town, waiting for her to walk in and ask for it. But the way this story ends is not the way you think. There is no courtroom verdict here, no judge banging a gavel. What happens instead happens across a kitchen table, and it is harder to watch than any trial could have been. Stay with me. Before we go any further, we would love to know where in the world you are watching this from. Drop your location in the comments right now, whether you are in Atlanta, Houston, Chicago, Detroit, or anywhere else on this earth. We read every single comment, and we love knowing who is in this community with us. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one come out regularly on this channel, and you do not want to find out about them 3 weeks late. Vivian Carter was born in Atlanta in 1968, the first child of Walter and Eleanor Carter, and for the first 10 years of her life, she was an only child, which meant she had her parents' full attention in a way that shaped her into a serious, watchful, deeply responsible young woman before she ever had a sibling to compare herself to. Walter Carter had started a small residential construction outfit in the early 1970s with a single crew and a pickup truck, and had built it, slowly and carefully, into a respected Atlanta development company that by the 1980s was putting up entire subdivisions in the growing suburbs south of the city. The household Vivian grew up in was one of quiet discipline. Her father was not a man who talked about feelings. He was a man who talked about work ethic and showing up and finishing what you started, and Vivian absorbed every part of that. She remembers being 8 years old and riding in the passenger seat of her father's truck on Saturday mornings while he checked on job sites, sitting quietly with a notebook in her lap because he had told her that if she was going to come along, she needed something to do. And so she would copy down the numbers he called out, lumber counts and delivery times, and she has told me that those Saturday mornings are some of her clearest memories of feeling like she mattered to him in a specific and useful way. In 1978, Terrence was born, 10 years after Vivian, and from the moment he arrived, something in the family's center of gravity shifted. Walter doted on his son in a way he had never quite managed with his daughter, not because he loved Vivian less, but because by the time Terrence came along, Walter's business had succeeded enough that he had more time and more emotional bandwidth to be the kind of father he had not been able to be a decade earlier. Vivian noticed this from the time she was 12 years old. She watched her father coach Terrence's Little League games on weekday evenings, something he had never had the time or the money to do for her at that age. And she made a private decision very young that she was not going to let that difference define her. She was going to build a life so solid that nobody would ever need to give her anything. In 1991, Eleanor Carter died of an aggressive cancer at the age of 46. Vivian was 23, working her first real job at an Atlanta real estate brokerage and saving money toward law school. Terrence was 13 years old, and the loss of their mother hit the family at the exact moment Walter's business was also absorbing the shock of a regional construction downturn. The funeral was held on a humid June morning, and Vivian remembers standing beside her father at the graveside, watching him hold Terrence's hand because Terrence, at 13, would not stop crying. And she remembers understanding in that moment with a clarity she did not yet have words for, that she was going to need to become the steady one in this family, because her father did not have it in him right then to be steady for 2 children at once. Vivian watched her father age 10 years in about 18 months after that. She watched him try to hold the company together and raise a teenage son alone, working late and coming home exhausted. And somewhere in that period, without ever being asked to in so many words, she made the decision that would define the next decade of her life. When Terrence graduated high school in 1996 and was accepted to Georgia Tech to study civil engineering, Vivian was 28 years old, established enough in her real estate career to be earning solid commissions. And she sat her father down at that same kitchen table where Eleanor used to keep the company books and told him she would cover what the family could not. She deferred her own plans for law school indefinitely. She took on extra listings. She worked weekends she did not have to work. And for 4 years, from 1996 to 2000, a significant portion of Vivian Carter's income went directly toward her younger brother's tuition, housing, and books at Georgia Tech. There were semesters where Terrence called her directly rather than going through their father, telling her he needed an additional few $100s for textbooks or a lab fee that had come up unexpectedly, and she always sent it, sometimes within the hour, because she has told me that in her mind there was never a version of this where she said no. She did it because that is what you do for family, and because her father's relief at not having to choose between his business and his son's education was worth more to her than the law degree she set aside. What she did expect, what she believed with complete sincerity for the next 20 years, was that her father understood exactly what she had given up and that it would be remembered. Terrence Carter graduated from Georgia Tech in 2000 and joined his father's company immediately, and over the following 2 decades he did something that, on its own, deserves real credit. He worked. He learned the business from the ground floor. He took on the unglamorous parts of development that his father had once handled alone, permitting and site work and contractor relationships. And by 2015, he had earned the title of Vice President of Carter Development Group and was widely understood inside Atlanta's real estate circles to be the heir apparent. Walter was proud of him, visibly and often. There is a specific moment Vivian remembers from a company anniversary dinner in 2017, a celebration of 45 years in business held at an Atlanta hotel ballroom, where Walter stood up to give brief remarks and spoke for nearly 10 minutes about Terrence's contributions to the company's growth, the permits he had pushed through, the contractor relationships he had salvaged and did not mention Vivian's name once. She has told me she sat in that ballroom telling herself it did not matter, that her father simply was not thinking about it in that moment. But she also told me it was the first time a small, specific doubt entered her mind about whether the sacrifice she made in her 20s had actually registered the way she always assumed it had. And Terrence, over those same 2 decades, began constructing a private narrative about his own role in the family that Vivian did not know was forming. He started to believe, genuinely and not cynically at first, that he was the child who had stayed, the one who showed up every single day for 20 years and built something alongside their father, while Vivian, in his retelling of their shared history, had gone off and built her own separate life as a real estate broker outside the family business. This version of events conveniently set aside the 4 years of tuition payments that had made his presence at Georgia Tech possible at all. It is a specific and common kind of self-deception, the kind where a person's daily proximity to a thing makes them feel they have earned more of it than someone whose contribution, while just as real, happened in the past and was not visible day to day. And by the time Walter Carter entered his 70s, that quiet rewriting of the family story had been happening inside Terrence's mind for the better part of 2 decades. Walter Carter's health began to decline noticeably around 2018, some memory lapses, repeating stories, occasionally losing track of which day it was, and by 2019 a geriatrician had given the family a preliminary diagnosis of early-stage vascular dementia, the kind that progresses unevenly, with good days and bad days. Terrence, who by this point was running most of the company's daily operations anyway, began taking over more and more of his father's personal affairs, his banking, his medical appointments, his legal paperwork. This was not unreasonable on its face. Someone needed to do it, and Terrence was the adult child who lived closest and worked inside the business already. The family hired a part-time home health aide named Renata, who came several afternoons a week to help Walter with meals and medication and light companionship, and Renata would later describe. In notes she kept as part of her professional documentation, a man whose clarity could shift dramatically within the same day, sharp and present in the morning. Then by mid-afternoon asking where his wife was and growing distressed when reminded that Eleanor had passed away decades earlier. Vivian, who lived across town and ran her own brokerage, trusted her brother to handle the logistics of their father's care. She visited her father regularly. She called him every Sunday evening without fail. But she was not in the room for the day-to-day decisions about his finances or his legal affairs, and she had no reason yet to believe she needed to be. In the spring of 2021, with Walter Carter's cognitive state fluctuating and his good days becoming less frequent than his bad ones, Terrence brought a revised estate planning package to his father for signature, a new trust document that restructured the ownership of Carter Development Group and reallocated the bulk of Walter's personal assets. The signing took place on a Wednesday afternoon at the family home, with a notary who worked occasionally for the company arriving for what she would later describe as a routine appointment. And Vivian was not present for any of it, was not told it was happening, and would not learn that this document existed until nearly 2 years later. What made this particular signing troubling is something that would only come to light much later. On the date the trust amendment was signed, Walter Carter had, according to his own geriatrician's notes from a visit 11 days earlier, scored in a range indicating significant impairment in decision-making capacity. Renata's own notes from that same week described Walter as having been confused for several consecutive days about where he was supposed to be. And on the Tuesday before the signing, the day before the notary arrived, Renata had recorded that Walter referred to his late wife Eleanor in the present tense twice during their afternoon together, asking Renata what time Eleanor would be home. None of this was disclosed to Vivian, and the document that resulted from that Wednesday signing named Terrence as the overwhelming primary beneficiary of both the company and the bulk of Walter Carter's estate, leaving Vivian a token allocation that, relative to what the original 2015 estate plan had specified, amounted to a fraction of what she had spent her entire adult life believing she would one day receive in equal measure with her brother. Walter Carter died in February of 2023 of heart failure at the age of 78. In a hospital room with Terrence present, Vivian arrived 40 minutes after the fact because Terrence had called her late, citing the chaos of the moment. And at the funeral, held at the same Atlanta church where Eleanor's service had taken place more than 30 years earlier, Vivian noticed something she could not fully name at the time, a specific carefulness in the way Terrence spoke to her, a quality of management rather than grief. He kept thanking people for coming with the smooth practiced ease of someone running a company event rather than burying his father. And 3 weeks after the funeral, in a conference room at the law firm that had handled the Carter family's estate matters for years, an attorney read aloud the terms of the 2021 trust amendment, and Vivian Carter, sitting in a chair she would later describe as feeling like it was tilting beneath her, understood in real time that the inheritance she had spent her whole life assuming would honor what she had given this family did not exist, that her brother had inherited the company, the primary family property, and the overwhelming majority of liquid assets. After the attorney finished reading, the room sat within a silence that nobody in it seemed willing to break first. Before we go any further, we would love to know where in the world you are watching this from. Drop your location in the comments right now and tell us what you think of this story so far. And if you are not subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We are building something real on this channel, and we want you to be part of it. In the days after the will reading, the extended Carter family did what families with a long shared history and a comfortable habit of avoiding conflict often do. They sided, gently and without much discussion, with the version of events that required the least confrontation, which was Terrence's version. He had been there every day for 20 years. He had built the company alongside their father and Vivian, in the soft retelling that spread through cousins and family friends over the following weeks, had her own successful career in her own life and had not needed the company the way Terrence did. Nobody said any of this to Vivian's face in those exact words, but she felt the specific and familiar coolness of a family quietly closing around a story that was not the full story. Her father's older sister, an aunt named Carol who Vivian had always been close to, stopped returning calls as quickly as she used to, and when Vivian finally reached her, Carol told her gently that Maybe it was time to let things be, that grief affects people differently, and that picking apart a dying man's final wishes would not bring her father back. Vivian, who had spent 25 years building a reputation in Atlanta real estate as someone careful and precise and not given to dramatic claims, found herself in the deeply disorienting position of being the person everyone quietly assumed was simply having trouble accepting a fair outcome. It was in late March, sitting alone in her father's empty house going through boxes of his old papers because someone needed to and Terrence had not offered, that Vivian found herself thinking about a conversation she'd had with her father roughly 4 months before he died. On what had been one of his clearer days, he had taken her hand at the kitchen table and told her, with an intensity that had struck her as unusual even at the time, that if anything ever felt wrong with how things were handled after he was gone, she needed to go talk to Lawrence. She remembers asking him what he meant and watching his expression cloud over the way it sometimes did when the dementia pulled him somewhere else mid-sentence, and the conversation had drifted, and she had filed it away as one of the increasingly frequent moments where her father said something that did not fully track. Sitting in his empty house 5 months later with a will in her bag that had just taken away nearly everything she believed she was owed, that sentence came back to her with a different weight entirely. Lawrence Dupree had been her father's personal attorney since the 1980s, long before the firm that handled the recent estate work had ever entered the picture. An old-school Atlanta lawyer in his 70s now, mostly retired, and Vivian had not thought of him in years. She called his office the next morning, and Lawrence Dupree, who had been wondering for the better part of 2 years whether this exact phone call would ever come, told her to come in that same afternoon. His office was smaller than she remembered, tucked into the second floor of an older building near downtown. The same dark wood shelving and the same smell of old paper she remembered from childhood visits with her father. What he told her when she sat down across from him is something Vivian describes as the moment the floor beneath the last 5 months finally became solid again. Lawrence told her that in late 2019, around the time Walter's dementia diagnosis had become official, Walter had come to him privately, without Terrence's knowledge. Deeply unsettled, Walter had told Lawrence that he had noticed his son becoming controlling about his affairs in a way that troubled him, that he was starting to forget things and he knew it, and that he was afraid of what might happen to the estate plan he had always intended, the one drawn up in 2015 that split everything evenly between his 2 children. Walter asked Lawrence to do something specific, to hold on to a sealed letter and a complete copy of the 2015 will, and to give both to Vivian, and only Vivian, if she ever came to him on her own, without being told to. Asking whether something about her father's final wishes did not add up, Lawrence told her he had been required by his own professional ethics and by Walter's explicit instruction to wait. He could not have reached out to her proactively without violating the specific condition Walter had set. The letter had to be requested, not delivered, because Walter, even in his fear, had wanted to be certain that if his daughter ever came looking for the truth, it would be because something inside her told her to look, not because someone told her where to find it. The letter, when Lawrence finally opened the envelope in front of her that afternoon, was 4 handwritten pages in Walter Carter's own hand, dated November of 2019, and it said, among other things, that he had never for one single day forgotten what Vivian gave up for this family, that he thought about her deferred law degree more often than he had ever told her, that he remembered every check she wrote for Terrence's tuition even though he had never once mentioned it out loud because he had been too proud and too ashamed of needing the help to bring it up, that he was frightened of his own mind and frightened of what his son might be capable of asking him to sign on a day when he could not fully understand what he was looking at, and that whatever document existed claiming to represent his final wishes after this letter was written should be measured against the 2015 will Lawrence was holding, because that 2015 document, splitting the company and the estate evenly between his 2 children, was the only one that reflected what Walter Carter actually wanted for his family. Vivian read those 4 pages in Lawrence Dupree's office, and has told me that for the first time since the will reading she was able to cry, not out of grief exactly, but out of the specific relief of discovering that the father she had believed in for 55 years had, in fact, been exactly the man she always thought he was. Now here is where this story does something I did not expect when I first started researching it. Vivian did not file a lawsuit. She has told me she thought about it for exactly 1 week. She spoke with an estate litigation attorney named Diane Foster, who had spent 2 decades specializing in cases involving undue influence and diminished testamentary capacity. And Diane told her honestly, after reviewing everything, that she had more than enough to bring a strong case. The geriatricians. Notes, Renata's contemporaneous records, the letter itself in their father's own handwriting. Diane laid it out plainly across that first meeting, told her this was, in her professional opinion, one of the more straightforward undue influence cases she had seen in years. But Vivian made a decision that surprised even Diane. She asked instead for one thing: a single meeting with Terrence, no attorneys in the room, just the two of them, at their father's kitchen table, the same table where Walter had once told her to go talk to Lawrence. Diane advised against it directly, told her that going in without legal protection while holding evidence this significant was not the standard approach, and that anything Terrence said in that room would not be on the record in any way that could help her later. Vivian told her she understood the risk and that she was doing it anyway, because she said something I have not been able to stop thinking about since she told me. She said, "I did not spend 25 years building my whole life around precision and evidence to use my last conversation with my brother as a transaction. I want him to look at me." Terrence agreed to the meeting. He has told people close to him that he assumed it was about logistics, signatures, paperwork to formalize what he already believed was settled. He arrived at their father's house on a Sunday afternoon in April, the same kind of warm spring afternoon their family had spent decades of Sundays in that house. Sat down across from his sister at the same kitchen table where they had eaten 1,000 meals as children, and Vivian, without raising her voice, without accusation in her tone, did one thing. She placed their father's handwritten letter on the table between them and asked him to read it out loud. He picked it up almost casually at first, the way you pick up something you expect to be unremarkable, and Vivian watched the moment his eyes caught their father's handwriting, watched something in his shoulders change before he had even read a single full sentence. Terrence has never spoken publicly about what happened in the 20 minutes that followed, and Vivian, when I asked her directly, told me only that she watched her brother's face change 3 separate times while he read those 4 pages. First, confusion, as he tried to reconcile the date at the top with what he believed he already knew. Then something that looked like fear, somewhere around the second page when their father's handwriting described the exact suspicions Terrence had hoped no one had ever noticed. And finally, somewhere around the third page, something she had not seen on her brother's face since they were children, which was simple, uncomplicated shame. What we do know, because it became part of the eventual private settlement record that both their attorneys later signed, is that Terrence did not deny the geriatrician's notes when Vivian laid them beside the letter, did not deny Renata's account, did not argue that the notary's brief time in the room had been anything other than what it was. He sat with all of it in front of him at that kitchen table for a long time, long enough that Vivian has told me she became aware of the specific late afternoon light moving across the table while she waited. And according to Diane Foster, who received a phone call from Vivian later that same evening, Terrence told his sister something that he has, to this day, repeated privately to almost no one else. He told her that somewhere over the last several years he had genuinely stopped being able to see clearly where his own hard work ended and where what she had given up for him began, that he had told himself a version of their family's story so many times that he had started to believe it completely, and that reading their father's words in their father's own handwriting was the first time in years he had been forced to put that version down and look directly at the one underneath it. 2 weeks later, without a single court filing, without a judge, without a public record beyond the private settlement agreement both siblings' attorneys drew up to make it official, Terrence voluntarily restructured the trust, the company, the family property, and the bulk of the estate were divided according to the original 2015 plan, evenly, exactly as their father had always told his daughter it would be. Vivian has told me she did not get an apology that day at the kitchen table. What she got instead was something she describes as more valuable and considerably more uncomfortable. She got to watch her brother stop defending himself. Terrence Carter did not attend the final meeting where the settlement was formally signed. His attorney handled it on his behalf, and according to people who know the family, he and Vivian have spoken only a handful of times since. Polite, careful, the specific kind of distance that exists between two people who know exactly what happened between them and have chosen, for now. Not to pretend otherwise, but also not to discuss it further. Vivian, for her part, has told me she does not feel triumphant. She feels something closer to grief layered on top of vindication. She got back what her father always intended for her to have. And in the process, she lost whatever version of her brother she had spent her whole life believing existed underneath the version who let himself believe he had earned what was never his alone to take, with a portion of her share of the estate. Vivian Carter established a scholarship fund in her father's name for first-generation college students from Atlanta pursuing degrees in architecture and design, the exact field she set aside for herself in 1996, and at the age of 56, more than a quarter century after she deferred her own education to make sure her brother could finish his, Vivian enrolled in a graduate architecture program here in Atlanta. She told me she is not doing it for anyone else this time. She is doing it because her father's letter reminded her that he had never stopped seeing the dream she gave up, and she decided, finally, that she was allowed to go pick it back up. Here is what stays with me about this story. Terrence Carter is not a man who set out one day to destroy his sister. He is a man who spent 20 years quietly convincing himself that daily proximity to a family business was the same thing as having earned the whole of it. And once he believed that story completely enough, taking advantage of his father's declining mind to make it legally official did not feel to him like theft. It felt like correcting an old imbalance that, in his retelling, had never existed in the first place. That is what makes this kind of betrayal so difficult to see coming from inside a family. It rarely looks like a villain plotting in the dark. It looks like a person who has told themselves a slightly adjusted version of history so many times that by the time they act on it, they have genuinely forgotten it is not entirely true. And what finally broke through that story was not a courtroom. It was not a judge. It was his sister sliding for handwritten pages across a kitchen table and asking him to read his own father's voice out loud until he could not avoid what it was telling him. So here's what I want to ask you before you go. The first question is about Terrence. Do you think a person can talk themselves into believing a self-serving version of events so completely that they stop being fully aware they are doing something wrong? Or do you think some part of him always knew exactly what he was doing and simply did not let himself look at it directly? And the second question is about Vivian's decision to go to that kitchen table instead of straight to court when she had more than enough evidence to win there. Do you think that was an act of strength? Or do you think she gave up leverage she did not need to give up? Drop your answers in the comments because I genuinely want to know what you think. If this story affected you, if it made you think about the quiet ways that sacrifice gets forgotten inside families when nobody is keeping score out loud, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit the like button if this story hit differently for you. And subscribe to Psyche Tales TV because we are telling the stories that matter on this channel, and this community is growing every single day, and we are grateful for every single one of you who is part of it. Take care of yourself. I will see you in the next one.
After all these years, it's still the most satisfying thing.